have a different periods or stages: pre-colonial period, Spanish period, American period, Japanese period, and the contemporary period. Father of Philippine literature is Jose Garcia Villar. Leona Florentino, known as the mother of Philippine women's literature. The origin of the Philippine language. The official language of the Philippines was Spanish for many centuries until the early half of the 20th century. The Philippines has 8 major dialects, listed in a figure from top to bottom: Bicol, Cebuano, Hiligaynon, Ilonggo, Ilocano, Kapampangan, Pangasinan, Tagalog, and Waray. Pre-colonial period. Pre-colonial literature in the Philippines, by one means or another, gave us an illustration from the past. It underscores on how our literature began in the country, which is the Philippines. Damiana L. Eugenio is known as the mother of Philippine folklore. Philippine literature classifies into 3 groups: folk narratives, folk speeches, and folk song. The first form of the Philippine literature is folk narratives. Folk narrative explain how the world was created, how certain animals possess certain characteristics, why some places have waterfalls, volcanoes, mountains, flora, or fauna. There's a different types of folk narrative. First is myth. Myth is a narrative that describes and portrays in symbolic language the origin of the basic elements and assumption of a culture. Second type of folk narratives is legend. Legend explain the original theme. Third types of folk narrative is fable. Fable used animal characters and allegory. And lastly, fantastic stories. Deals with underworld characters such as Tiyanak, Aswang, and Capre. Folk speeches is the second form of Philippine literature. And there's a different types of folk speeches. First is riddle or bugtong in Tagalog, patototdon in Bicolano, paktakon in Ilonggo, higmo in Cebuano. Riddles is made up of 1 or more measured lines with rhymes and may consist of 4 to 12 syllables. Examples: mahaba ang bituka at ito'y lumilipad. Kapag mahangin, ito'y tinatamad. Answer: saronggola. Lumuluha kahit walang mata, lumalakad walang paa. Answer: ulap. Another type of folk speeches is proverb. Proverb is a simple and concrete saying, popularly known and repeated, that expresses a truth based on common sense or experience. It describes a basic rule of conduct and serves as law or rule on good behavior by our ancestors. Examples: aanhin mo pa ang damo kung patay na ang kabayo. Kung walang tiyaga, walang nilaga. Now, let's proceed to the last form of Philippine folk literature, which is folk song. Here are some examples of folk songs. First is lullaby, hele or oyayi, ambahan, mangyan, kalusan in Ibatan, tagay in Cebuano and Waray, kanogan in Cebuano. And again, the 3 forms of Philippine folk literature are folk narrative, folk speeches, and folk songs. The second period is the Spanish period. The start of the Philippines' more colorful history took place in March 6, 1521, when Ferdinand Magellan docked on the shores of Homonho. The Filipinos were then called Ladinos, meaning they were Latinized. Filipinos were called two things. One is taga-bayan, while the other is taga-bukid or taga-bundok. A person who is a taga-bayan is considered urban and civilized, and were in easy range of the church and state. A person who is a taga-bundok or taga-bukid is called a brute salvage or savage brute, or Indio, and were the ones who live far from the center of the Spanish power. The Spanish period have a different form. The first one is religious literature. Religious literature revolves around the life and the death of Jesus Christ. There's a different types of religious literature. First is passion. It is about the passion, journey, and suffering and the death of Jesus Christ. Second is cenaculo. It is the reenactment of the passion. And third is comedia. It depicts the European society through love and pain, but can also be a narrative about a journey, just like Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. It is also considered religious because it is usually depict the battle between the Christian and the Saracen or the Moros. Secular or non-religious literature revolves around tales of valiance and adventure. There's a different types of secular or non-religious literature. First is awit. These are tales of chivalry where a knight saves a princess. Next, corrido is a metrical tale or a tale that follows the structure of a poem. And lastly, prose narrative are easy to understand instructional materials that in a literary light that teaches Filipinos on proper decorum. The third forms of Spanish period is propaganda literature. These were in the forms of satires, editorials, and news articles that aimed to attack the Spanish rule. Here are some examples of propaganda literature from Graciano Lopez Jaena, Ang Pray Botod, Lawa del Fraile, or The Child of Friar, and Everything is Hambog, or Everything is Mercio. From Marcelo H. Del Pilar, Kaiingat Kayo, or Be Careful, Dasalan at Toksohan, or Prayers and Jokes, Ang Kadakilaan ng Diyos, or God's Goodness. From Dr. Jose Rizal, No Limitang Hirit. And the last form of Spanish period is revolutionary literature. Examples from Andres Bonifacio, katungkulan gagawin ng mga anak ng bayan, ang dapat pabatid ng mga Tagalog. From Emilio Jacinto, Liwanag at Dilim. From Apolinario Mabini, El Desarrollo y Caída de la República Filipina. From Dr. Jose Rizal, El Filibusterismo. Now let's proceed to the American period. The Philippines had a great leap in education and culture. The use of English alongside Filipino was practiced. The Philippines public school was introduced. Free public instruction was given to the Filipinos. The literature during the American period was considered as imitative of American model. Instead of asking the student to write originals, students ended up following the form of American poets. The first form of American period was poetry. Poetry under the American rule still followed the style of the old, but had contents that ranged from free writing to societal concerns under the American. Jose Corazon de Jesus, popularly known as Batute, created his own generation with his first book of poems. Examples of his works are Kalupi ng Puso, Manggagawa, Puso Ano Ka, Isang Punong Kahoy sa Pamilihan ng Puso. The second form is drama. Drama usually used in the American period to degrade the Spanish rule and to immortalize the heroism of the men who fought under the Katipunan. Severino Reyes, spearheaded movement to supplant the komedya with a new type drama, the zarzuela, a Filipino adaptation of the Spanish zarzuela. Examples of his works are Ang Halik ni Judas, Opera Italiana, Puso ng Isang Pilipina, Ang Bagong Fausto, Filotea o Ang Pag-aasawa ni San Pedro. The last form of American period is remake novels. Remake novels took up Dr. Jose Rizal's portrayal of social condition by colonial repression. Gabriel Beato Francisco is best known for his trilogy of Fulgencia Galvillo, 1907, Kapitan Bencio, 1907, Alfaro, 1909, depicting the 30 years of colonial repression by the Spanish rule. The next period is Japanese period and the Republic. The Philippine literature came into a half. The use of the English language was forbidden, and the use of the Filipino language was mandated under the Japanese rule. For some, this was a problem, but most writers, it was a blessing in disguise. Almost all newspapers were stopped except for some. Filipino literature was given a break during this period. Many wrote plays, poems, short stories, etc. Topics and themes were often about life in the provinces. The first form of Japanese period is drama. The drama experience allowed during the Japanese period because movie houses showing American films were closed. The big movie houses were just made to show stage shows. Many of the plays were a production of English plays to Tagalog. Next is newspaper. Writings that came out during this period were journalistic in nature. Writers felt suppressed but slowly, the spirit of nationalism started to seep into their consciousness. While some continued to write, the majority waited for a better climate to publish their works. And next is poetry. The common theme of most poems during the Japanese occupation was nationalism, country, love, and life in the barrios, faith, religion, and the arts. The next is fiction. The field of the short story widened during the Japanese occupation. Many wrote short stories. And last is essay, were composed to glorify the Filipinos and at the same time to figuratively attack the Japanese. Contemporary period. The Rebirth of Freedom, 1946 to 1970. The Americans returned in 1945. Filipinos rejoiced and guerrillas who fled to the mountain joined the liberating American army. On July 4, 1946, the Philippines regained freedom and the Filipino flag waved joyously alone. The United States formally recognized the independence of the Republic of the Philippines. Period of activism, 1970 to 1972. Many young people became activists to ask for changes in the government. In the expression of desire for change, the writings of some youth who were fired with nationalism in order to emphasize the importance of their petition. The period of the New Society, 1972 to 1980. The period of the New Society started at September 21, 1972. The Carlos Palanca Awards continued to give annual awards. Almost all themes in most writing dealt with the development or progress of the country, like the Green Revolution, family planning, proper nutrition, environment, drug addiction, and pollution. The New Society tried to stop pornography or those writing giving bad influence on the morals of the people. All school newspapers were temporarily stopped and so with the school organizations. The period of the Third Republic, 1981 to 1985. After 10 years of military rule and some changes in the life of the Filipino which started under the New Society, martial rule was at last lifted on January 2, 1981. To those in government, the lifting of military rule heralded a change. To their perceptions, the Philippines became a new nation and this, former President Marcos called the New Republic of the Philippines. Current period 1986 to 1999. History took another twist. Once more, the Filipino people regained their independence which they lost 20 years ago. In the span of 4 days from February 21 to 25, 1986, the so-called people power or lakas ng bayan prevailed. Together, the people barricaded the streets petitioning the government for changes and reforms.